We're recording on there, and we're recording on here.
I'm Janine, I'm she/her. I work in social care and I'm 59 and I'm living in Glasgow. Okay, so I was brought up in Wales, which was not renowned for being very queer friendly in the 80s to say the least. So I've probably known I was gay from the age of about 6 or 7, to be honest. But coming out of school was really seriously not an option between the ages of 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And it was really only when I left home that I was able to be the person that I wanted to be. So I named myself a lesbian the minute I got on a train to go to Leicester to go and study. Like lots of people did at that time. We didn't say who we were or what we were to those that were closest around us because of the homophobia that was just evident at school, evident at college, evident in Wales.
What was Leicester like in comparison?
Well, Leicester was brilliant because it had a thriving lesbian and gay scene, and I'm saying lesbian and gay scene because that's what it was at that time. So there was a couple of pubs and a big club, and there was also a lot of socialist or left-wing activity going on at the time. So I was part of an organisation called Left Out, which was very much around welcoming people from all communities into spaces that were safe at that time. It didn't name itself, but it was generally queer friendly. So there was always somewhere to go. So Leicester was a hell of a lot different to North Wales, which was where I was brought up. So I guess that's where I got some of my political education from. And it was the place I felt safe and welcomed, and it made no difference to friends that I had at college because we were all there experiencing something for the first time. It was great.
What were you studying?
I was studying speech therapy. Along with a bunch of evangelical Christians. So actually being out as a lesbian was an interesting experience. So that taught me how to be able to stand up for myself and be able to argue because it was very clear that what my course was not welcoming of my sexuality. Most people that I was friends with were. So I guess everybody just needs to feel valued and loved and welcomed. And I was. So I was one of the lucky ones.
How did you deal with the other people in your course?
Well, I challenged them. I sought some support from, ironically, one of the psychology lecturers, although it was only just 3 or 4 years after kind of having issues to do with mental health and being gay or queer were no longer a prescribed illness. So up until the beginning of the 80s, it was a medicalised view of what was then called homosexuality. So I worked with them, and I went on to then work with people who needed support, who were trans actually, who were moving from one self to a different self, and it was around supporting them to do with their voices. So there was a need for all of us to move forward and to learn and to be embracing of people that needed support.
How were things with your family and your parents?
Not exactly warmly welcome. Although I came from a family that actually, I had a lesbian aunt, but she died when I was about 11, and I remember her and her partner. So we're talking about 2 women being relatively out in the 40s, 50s and 60s. That's pretty major. I also had an uncle that I never knew, but he was a gay man. So actually from the same clutch of aunties and uncles, I had one of either identity. So I knew there was something in the family, but just nobody was naming it. They didn't talk about my Auntie Trudy's partner, Emily, although she clearly was her partner. So it took a very long time to desensitize my family with just keeping on and on and on at them. I probably never ever got there with my mother. I'm sure I'm not alone with that, but one has to keep trying or leave it behind and accept that they can't move with you. So I guess that's probably a lifetime journey, unlike no different to a lot of people still now. But I would hope that families are more welcoming of who people are, of their sons, daughters, loved ones, sisters, brothers, etc. But that was certainly not my experience. It took years and years of keeping on at them and shoving books in front of them and raising it at a dinner table and big rows and all sorts of stuff.
Did you feel you took on that educator role quite a lot?
Yeah, it was very much about me helping them to be able to understand. And whilst there, at that time in the mid-80s, there was material from Terry Sanderson, I think is his name. It was a very important book written around gay men for parents. There was no sort of families and friends of lesbians and gay men. They were just not around at that time. So there was nowhere for people to really get support from if parents or families were confused. And all you had to read was the tabloids. And at that time, we were moving into Section 28, the dreaded piece of legislation that sort of banned discussion of homosexuality within schools. So the climate was a hostile one, and families and my loved ones picked up on that.
What age were you when you heard of Section 8?
28. So, oh God, you're making me do this, which is a difficult thing. So I'd be 23, 24. And it was a huge deal at that time because I'd been working in schools with children. So it was a big deal for teachers. It was a big deal for particularly lesbian teachers, of which there was a lot of them in primary schools. And they were just starting to come out at that time. And it was a time when people were feeling more proud of themselves. There were still lesbian strength marches, there was gay pride, there was lesbian and gay pride. So there was a lot of people building a sense of self at the time. And yet this piece of legislation, this direct attack by the right, it was deliberate to really focus on other, not that different to what's happening right now in terms of the trans debate within the media. So it's very familiar. The only thing we haven't got quite is the same law, certainly not in Scotland, but the same law within the UK, as was sort of outrightly banning. This is somewhat, I'm trying to find the right word. This is transphobia by stealth in terms of legal activities, although very clearly people's legal rights are being attacked. So it's very, very similar, and it's not surprising that this is under a Conservative government, is all I can say at the moment. So it was very important to be involved in the anti-Section 28 stuff. So I was involved in marches, and eventually I moved to Manchester, where there was a huge lesbian and gay community. When I say huge, I mean 20, 30,000 of us on the streets, and a big scene. So there was fierce opposition, is probably the best way to describe it, and that included Manchester City Council at that time.
And when were you first aware of AIDS, or whatever it was known as?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was known as, I think it was GRID, and I'm trying to remember what GRID stood for, but it became it became AIDS, obviously acquired immune deficiency syndrome, around 1982. So I got to find out about it in 1984, and it started to become really clear to me, being out and about at that time in Leicester. There was a real sense of fear. There were more attacks on gay men, visibly gay men on the street. There was stuff that was, kind of fly postering and all sorts of things that were just directly homophobic and wrong, in terms of people were so frightened about whether you could acquire it through kissing. The amount of comedy that there was at that time from mainstream that really honed in on gay men in particular, about being other, and almost poking fun of the fact that there was something that seemed to really focus. There was a disease that seemed to just belong to men who are having sex with men, or men who identified as gay, which, as we know now, was so very wrong, because actually there were people who were using drugs who were not identified as gay. There was women who were at that time using unsafe sex because they didn't really know what safe sex was in terms of working on the streets as sex workers. So it was not, it knew no boundaries. AIDS still knows no boundaries, but there was a real disservice around the public information campaigns and the amount of, I'd call it AIDS phobia, that was whipped up at the time. And it was only through voluntary organisations, which were originally the switchboards, that got information out. And my first encounter probably with people in Scotland who were either campaigning or were living with HIV was through the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. I joined Manchester ACT UP, which is what was directly a campaigning organisation, and it's where we met with all sorts of people. So I certainly remember coming up to Edinburgh and meeting a whole bunch of folks, many women using drugs, many gay men we were campaigning for access to treatment, we were campaigning to access to drugs, we were campaigning about the way that people with AIDS were being treated within the media. There was a whole set of guidelines that should have been followed by National Union journalists that drew them up, and we're trying to enforce it through their journalists working on all sorts of papers, and still a backlash from the red tops and the tabloids. This is way before the web was available and social media was around. So our role was very much about doing direct action that drew attention on the streets and media stunts. So everything from dancing to kiss-ins to blocking roads to hitting condoms over prison walls because men were having sex with men in prison, and the prisons across all of the UK were not giving out condoms, so there was no safer sex available for men who were not necessarily gay identified, but certainly were having penetrative sex with one another. So we campaigned on all sorts of things, but certainly there was a thriving community within Edinburgh that was very, very representative of both gay men, many lesbians like me, and also many women who were street workers who needed to feel safe, and quite frankly were getting attacked because they were seeing that they were seen as being a transmitter, etc. So, Scotland, I know, was not immune. The whole community that came together was genuinely a UK-wide community. I remember being in the Lesbian and Gay Centre that used to be in the south of London, and Jimmy Somerville, who happened to be Mr. Small Town Boy originally, was from Glasgow, was one of the founder members of ACT UP London, and he was there. So Scotland reached out to England, who reached back to Scotland, who reached into Wales. So we were all over the place, and we would support one another as chapters of ACT UP to take action to ensure that people had a hope in life, as well as directly campaigning for access, most importantly, to drug treatments, because the drug companies had the treatments, they were just not making them available. Certainly not within the UK anyway at that time.
So you were in ACT UP in Manchester?
Yeah, that's right. So I was part of ACT UP Manchester for a good 6 or 7 years. But I also was a buddy to a friend of a friend who was living with AIDS, and at that time the drugs weren't working. So he was coming to end of life, and he had loads of loving support from friends, but unfortunately rejection from his family, his mother and his sisters, and it was really only at the very, very, very end of his life that they came around. the Catholic Church waded in with him, and priests turned up when he was really very, very ill, etc., and often had to stop them coming in because that was against his wishes. So I was directly involved in supporting a dear guy who was a friend of mine, eventually, but a friend of a friend, and that was through an agency, a voluntary organisation called George House Trust, who provided befriending services and safe spaces for people living with HIV, for women and children, because there were children living with HIV and they were a hidden population people didn't recognise. So I was very, very involved at many levels, both on a campaigning level, but at a personal level as well. And it's not an easy thing to do. But our role was not about, as a befriender, our role was not about being seen, it was about the person that we were supporting. There were many, many other lesbians like me that were really involved in doing things quietly and didn't make a big deal about it. Only some of us were also involved in campaigning, and there was at least 10 lesbians involved in ACT UP Manchester and a whole variety of women who supported the gay men that they cared for, etc. So it was a really great bunch of people to be involved with from all sorts of different walks of life and all ages. And I guess those providing support were often the invisible ones, and those who appeared in the paper or on the news in some cases, or being interviewed on the radio, which I was many times, were the ones that were able to be brave enough to be up front. So I'm aware that I stand with others who perhaps, for all sorts of reasons, haven't been able to talk about who they are and where they are and why they've been involved in AIDS activism. But to me, it's a really important thing. It's an important part of my life to enable people to have their civil rights, their human rights respected, and not to be actively discriminated against.
So you're talking about the lesbians that were involved. How was that as lesbians but also as women?
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel misogyny in that culture, and what was that like with caring for men? Mm-hmm. How did they treat you as a woman as well as a lesbian?
Yeah. So, well, I've done everything from going into for doing condom drops in men-only clubs in the past, and had certainly guys turning around and giving me a hell of a row about why I was going into the edge of dark rooms, etc. And all of that is on the basis of safety. So I was fully able to have arguments with people. I'm not saying there wasn't misogyny around. Absolutely there was. We found a common cause, though, at that time in particular. It was on the back of, there was Section 28. There were many friends of mine that were diagnosed with HIV. Most of them, I'm delighted to say, are still living. There's some who are no longer with us, some activists who are no longer with us. John Campbell, one of Edinburgh's finest, who went on to be well recognised in the Houses of Parliament and well recognised within Scottish civil society later on in life, was also heavily involved. So those men were coming from an anti-discrimination point of view. So they were not misogynistic, but I'm not saying that there wasn't great amounts of misogyny on the scene, huge amounts. So, at that time there were very few lesbian-only spaces. There certainly were lesbian and gay spaces, but it was mainly a men's scene. And there was also an element of some men feeling they were out socialising. They didn't want to think, and I can understand it, because AIDS was right in front of their face. This was about who they slept with and who'd slept with who, and the chain reaction that there was around HIV and how it was contracted and passed on, and the lack of knowledge going back to 1981 and the founding of the Terence Higgins Trust. So, HIV was transmitted very, very quickly amongst a community. So many men would not go for tests. They didn't want to know. So, a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday afternoon in a dark room was escapism to some. that's not me excusing it. There's no excuse, but I saw many people who went on to die because AZT, one of the first drugs, didn't work. It wasn't the panacea that the drug companies said it was going to be. So I saw many men die, but towards the end of their lives, they certainly changed their approach, and it's almost like the space and care that they could get were from lesbians and or women, who didn't identify as lesbians. But there was a much wider caring community, everything from healthcare workers that were appalled in the way that they'd been advised to act within hospitals, big hospitals. This happened in Scotland as much as it did in England. We were all part of the same NHS at that point, and the guidance was super careful, take care. We've still got instances in Scotland I'm fully aware of, because my partner works in a hospital, where there's anti-HIV jokes still being made in 2024. What the hell's that about? Have we really not moved on? Is the level of ignorance so poor for healthcare staff that they're not trained on the fact that you can live fulfilled and amazing lives living with HIV? So I sometimes wonder whether we've learned from our past. But in answer to your question, yes, misogyny absolutely was around, and some of it was very much directed about people didn't want to know. They didn't want to know. They didn't want you to put something in front of their face that scared them, quite frankly. I can understand where it was coming from, but it doesn't excuse the reaction. I'm a 5'2" woman. I'm talking about 6'4" blokes, all in leather and partly clothed, etc. And it was about doing condom drops. This was for their safety too.
What was the nightlife like in the 80s, but also in Manchester? Were you a partier?
Oh God, I'm out and about. So we had a whole street called Canal Street, which is still there, that has a thriving queer scene. So we were the lucky ones. We had places to go. I do remember the first lesbian bar I went to was upstairs. Obviously there was a men's bar downstairs, and we had to knock to go upstairs. I mean, really, what's that about? I wonder whether we would perhaps find that quite exciting, actually, having to knock to go in or whatever. So there was a thriving queer scene, and I'm saying queer because many of us identified ourselves as queer too. There was a lesbian and gay and a TVTS scene in Manchester way back in the early 90s and late 80s. And there was a sense of pride. So businesses invested heavily in actually lesbian and gay in particular spaces. They were making a lot of money. It was only at the point that alcohol companies and certainly beer companies jumped on to what was then to become the Pink Pound. That probably didn't translate into a marketing tool until 93, 94, but for 5-6 years there was sponsorship quietly in the background, because actually they were making a large amount of money, because people would come from all over the north, west and east of England to go to Manchester at that time. I remember coming to Glasgow and trying to find where to go, and it was I sort of expected that there'd be a street, and obviously there's no street. You have to kind of go looking for it in all sorts of places to find the space that you want to go out. So it was very important to have a sense of pride. So, and also a street that there's no cars on. You tottered, you walked up and down Canal Street, and you had opportunities to meet other people from all walks of life, of every, I'm going to say every gender at that time, because people may not have used the term they them, but they would have described themselves as other, whatever that other meant. And that's important. So we always need to remember where we come from. So yeah, there was loads of places to go, and I was certainly out Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, sometimes doing still condom drops and stuff, or leafleting or campaigning, but very much having a good time at all hours. God only knows how I worked at the same time too, but there we are.
How important was that to have fun as a community?
Hugely important. I think there's something about, we did all sorts of direct action. So our direct action would always end up eventually in some sort of gathering afterwards, wherever we were going to do. So one piece of direct action was in a gallery called, I think, Viewpoint in Salford, which is the city actually right next to Manchester, so you can't tell which bit's Manchester, what bit's Salford, where we took over a gallery opening because the city council worried about being accused under Section 28 and whether any kids would come in, and also there were explicit images around men who were having sex with men safely. They withdrew some of the photographs, so we went in and did a direct action and did a die-in, and started singing from the floor, and the police had to move us, and it took about 3 hours, and it was all over all the media. So it was on TV, it was on the radio. Please remember, there was no social media at that time. It was in the papers. Because they'd self-censored something that actually was, from the artist's point of view, really hugely important. It was an image that actually was promoting safer sex, but they'd taken it out. So that, there was a sense of camaraderie. We met in a community centre underneath a block of flats that were called Fairy Towers. There were that many gay men that used to live in it, and so there was probably about 70 of us. We made a hell of a lot of noise, and when you get people collectively singing, inside and outside, you start to draw media attention. It's really easy then for people to be able to film from outside. So there was a hell of a lot of filming that was involved in it, and Canal Street was never more than a mile away to go and have a beer afterwards. So it was very much a really strong sense of community, and youngest people, we were careful as a group to have people over the ages of 18 onwards. We're very aware that some young people may well have been vulnerable. We had constitution. We formally worked to principles that were democratic. We revolved chairs. There was no chairperson of the group or whatever. It was collective action, and we met in all sorts of places. We ended up actually being allowed to meet in Manchester City Council, and they laid on tea and coffee for us. And when the Labour government came in 1997, when the Conservatives were defeated, we were all invited to the party that took place overnight, because we'd become a part of being a visible face of what was a really important scene, because it was political. Being able to go out in a cesspit of homophobia in the early 80s was political. Hometown Boy, the song, is a powerful piece of political rhetoric. We need to remember always where we come from. Well, I guess probably one of the things that we should recognise, that there was many women living with HIV, and they were invisible. It was not safe for them in general to be upfront around their HIV status. I'm not aware of any woman that I met who would identify themselves as formally as a lesbian. I certainly met bisexual women who were living with HIV. And they were incredibly careful about their identity. There was no way they could be on a demonstration with us. So I'm very aware that I was one of the lucky ones being able to speak and often amplify the voices of others. So what we did was very clearly always have someone living with HIV who was able to be able to speak for themselves. It's not about my words, it's somebody else's words. But I'm very aware that there was invisible people and silent voices, and many men, gay men who live with HIV, whose families to this day don't know that they died of AIDS. So those are the hidden stories that we need to uncover, and they've been partly uncovered through drama and art and culture, but it's really important if there's a way for parents, loved ones, families, friends to speak up and tell the history. It's an important one. We are where we come from. We carry the backs of hundreds of thousands of queer people before us who are not as lucky as we are.
Why do you think it is that the women are the invisible minority within an invisible minority almost that had HIV?
That's a great question. So why are the women invisible women? Okay, so they're invisible within the community and then invisible anyway. Double invisibility. At that time, I'm talking really from 86, 87 right the way through to probably the mid-90s. I think it was about they were not able to come together because they didn't know whether there was anybody else. They were the odd ones, if you're with me. It was only in the early 90s, I think, that, late 80s, 89, 90, that Positively Women, which was a charity that was set up specifically for women living with HIV. It was set up in London, but we ended up with spaces in Manchester for certain and in Edinburgh where women were meeting together. They wouldn't meet in an HIV or AIDS centre. They would meet somewhere that looked like a women's centre or was a community centre. And also, many of them had children. And it was not clear what social services would do. There was a real fear about what was going to happen if you had a child and you were living with certainly a life-threatening, if not ending up being a life-limiting illness, dependent on what drug treatment you were able to take. Women were concerned around what might happen if they had children, whether social services or teachers would know or get involved and the kids might be taken off them. They were often bringing children up on their own, and they didn't have supportive families around them for whatever reason. If they'd been using drugs, the last thing that they wanted to do was actually invite social services to be involved. So, I do know of formalised religion. Churches helped out, all sorts of things. So there was lots of quiet support. It was mainly a social support that they needed, and it was really important that women got space together as well. So having AIDS organisations that eventually recognised the needs of women and children was hugely important. I went on to work in one of them in a bit of the northwest of England called Staffordshire Buddies, and set up, and we had 23 families from all over different bits of the northwest of England in rural areas that came eventually to come and do children and women's activities, but we couldn't ever have them anywhere near the HIV centre. They just would not come. We needed to ensure that people were buddied up and supported and peer support with one another.
And was that to protect themselves and their children?
It was absolutely to protect themselves and their children. There was real fear that they'd get attacked. I mean, even in the late 90s, there was still, the phrase "don't die of ignorance" is a really strange one used by a UK government, but people eventually, did have their lives shortened because of the harassment that they faced in small communities in particular. So it was extremely real, and that's what really disappoints me to hear bloody nursing students, making jokes now around HIV. That's just not funny. There's lots of things we can all have a laugh about, but don't pick on someone who identifies as being queer and who happens to have HIV and find some joke about that, they need to be barrier nursed. I mean, really, isn't that funny? So it just makes me very, very annoyed that sometimes we have not moved on. Yeah. We've not moved on almost 20 years later. So, yeah, a lot of women were invisible, and amongst that were many bisexual women who did sleep with women but had probably in the past been drug-using women.
So you say you work within care and is it nursing?
No, I work in social care.
In social care.
I work within an organisation that supports people with learning disabilities and complex mental health issues. So I don't do most of the hard work. Some of my colleagues do the hard work, but yes, I work in social care.
When did you start training in that?
Only a couple of years ago, so I'm very recent in that. I've done all sorts of other things. A lot of the activism that I've done has come from a place of having worked in a law centre for many years of my life, and the law and upholding people's rights, and most importantly their human rights, is incredibly important to me.
Do you want to talk a bit more about kind of working in law? How was that?
Sure, of course I can. So
when did that start?
So started in 1990. I worked in Salford Law Centre, and there were 7 of us. We were a collective, so that meant that there was nobody paid more than anybody else, that everybody was of the same status. There happened to be myself and another 2 women who happened to be lesbians, so 3 out of the 7 of us happened to be lesbians, so it was a little bit of a lesbian space. We did a lot of work around access to community social services. So we did actually take Salford City Council to court. We took a judicial review, which means we were challenging how they were supporting people with HIV and how they were not providing the right level of services. And we won on behalf of the people that were complaining, who were brave enough to give statements. At that time in the 90s, that was a big deal. So I guess my sense of social justice has been formed out of doing that work between 1990 and 97. It's very much about kind of people's rights are really important, and particularly in the climate that we're living in 2024, funnily enough, the same things we're in a hostile environment for refugees, we're in a hostile environment for people who are trans. We're not living in a world that's as inclusive as it should be, despite everybody making great statements about how wonderful it may be. We've still got a lot of public education work to do. So for me, it's really important stuff. Children, are taught their rights from an early age in primary schools. Really important, because they then go on to be full and active citizens and then can stand up for themselves. It's very important to me.
And you've spoken about how places were lesbian and gay centres, or the kind of terminology around it. Do you remember when the term LGBT, when the L was put to the beginning? Yeah,
the L was put to the beginning, to my knowledge, around 84, 85. When the London Lesbian and Gay Centre, I remember, was founded. And I remember going down there because I'd hop on trains from Leicester. It's only 90 minutes away, and then go out all night and then come back on the train, etc., fall asleep. So there was always something going on. Those social spaces are still important in my view. It's not just about a commercial scene. We need places to go. We need places to feel safe, whether that's art centres or venues or pop-up stuff or whatever. We just need to feel safe. So the L came, I think, in the mid-80s, and it was very much about lesbians being invisible and making ourselves visible. It certainly was mirrored in America. I mean, there were some braver people then. There were some braver lesbian comics that God only knows how they were standing up for themselves, but they did. It's hugely important, but I guess they're louder, and there's more of them in the States than there are in the UK. So remember that the L is LGBTQI for a very good reason. My memory in Manchester was certainly, it was lesbian and gay, bisexual pride. We got to the mid-90s and bisexual was included. There was a huge TS scene, and I'm using those terms because those are the terms that were used in the 90s, not the terms that I want to use now. So I'm not trying to upset anybody in that process, but there were spaces and helplines and support groups for one another. People always clustered together. We find our tribes.
And we've spoken about your parents not them not understanding or not getting along with them. How do you feel about the term chosen family, and do you feel like you have that, or have that?
No, good question. So, do I have a chosen family? I actually do have a chosen family, because I ended up supporting 2 children of an ex-partner of mine. So, they're twins. I won't name them because I don't have their permission to name them, but one now has a baby. Both of them are incredibly proud of the fact that they tottered down Canal Street in Manchester with me too. I had to go to court to get access to them. Long story, but there was the world of recognising alternative parenting. I think it was called alternative parenting. We had alternative lifestyles in the 90s. So I guess the term we'd use now, chosen family. So my family is not a blood family. I have no brother now, he died last year. I have no mother, I have no father. So my family absolutely is a chosen family. It's my partner, it's the 2 girls and their little one, and lots of wonderful friends all over the UK and Europe. So I'm lucky. But I guess I think I've got to the place that I am because I had real support from people, sometimes straight friends in my 20s, when I was 20, 21, 22, who stood up and argued when they met homophobia and came on marches with us and supported us. So there's still a whole bunch of us that all went to Leicester Polytechnic years ago, and we still meet one another and they're still supportive, and so they're my chosen family too. We are sometimes where we come from and sometimes where we end up. So I ended up somewhere I was lucky enough to get people that love me and still love me. So we should all have a chosen family. We can all choose who feels closest to us, and I hope that families are more embracing around having a son or a daughter or a member of their family that comes from another identity than they do. I hope the world has moved on a little bit. I've certainly met loads and loads of proud parents along the way, and long may that continue, but it was not the case in the 80s. It certainly wasn't the case in the 70s. Many, many people I know don't speak to their birth families even still.
Can I ask you to explain your t-shirt and
explain
your wonderful outfit?
So Action Equals Life is a phrase that we used to use within ACT UP. So that was AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. So this actually was an ACT UP London t-shirt, and I couldn't believe I could still find it and fit into it. So the pink triangle was chosen particularly because obviously it's a pink triangle but reversed from the way that the pink triangle that gay men were forced to wear within the Second World War and German oppression under the Nazis. Action Equals Life is because it was about life affirming. At the time that we all came together, there was no cure for AIDS. By doing something, by protesting, by raising awareness, by joining organisations, it was really important for us to be doing something. So the reverse of Action Equals Life is silence equals death. If we remain invisible, we won't progress. And at that time, it did mean death. It meant that actually you weren't getting access to treatment. You weren't getting services. You often were very isolated within communities, because many people living with HIV were really, really frightened of others finding out. They didn't go near children. They didn't go near other people in close proximity, because there was still a fear, even though eventually we knew that you can't be passed through air, and it would have to be blood-to-blood transmission, and the blood would have to be active for 15 minutes or less, etc. It's still, people were still very, very frightened, because there'd been public information campaigns that put the fear of God into people. So it was a way of breaking down fear, and a lot of it was about, you've got a whole bunch of people that are all dressed in black trousers, or sometimes we'd wear masks dependent on where we were going and what we were doing. But we would often look very similar, and that was deliberate because we were aiming so you couldn't tell whether it was a woman, what the gender in inverted commas was, what the gender was, or how people identified. And in some cases, some of the people living with HIV would cover part of their faces. They didn't want to be seen, but they were still nevertheless brave enough to walk across streets and block streets. And we took over the BBC at one point. Actually, we ended up on the news because there was a news camera that came down. So, and that was around the poor coverage that there was on the BBC, and that was simultaneous action that took place in Scotland too. So something must have happened over here. So it was very much about being visible and being similar. So we weren't looking, we were wanting to be recognised. And that's where the action equals life comes from. And if anybody sees the film Stonewall, some of the history around 50 years of Pride, you will see lots of the banners that were being carried both in London and New York and San Francisco, where you've got ACT UP San Francisco and you've got ACT UP New York. ACT UP was an international organisation all over Europe, in South Africa too, and that was really brave for people, particularly black people, being involved in arguing over access to treatment. So it's very much, it's about life affirming, taking a positive step. So I just thought I'd shove a pink suit on if we're doing something that's related to being queer.
It all matches, it's great.
Mm-hmm.
How was being, obviously, were you seeing a lot of what was happening in America at the time? Was that covered at all, or is it only in retrospect you know about?
No, we saw it because we got faxes. Nobody that's watching this will know what a fax is. However, a fax was an ability to be able to send a piece of paper from one country or one place to another immediately, and it was down a telephone line. So we were faxing all over the place. So I had a fax in my bedroom, I had a fax at work. It was the nearest we got to social media. So we would be, at the time we were talking to people in South Africa, we were talking to people in New York, we were talking to people in Berlin, we were talking to Paris, and we were sharing information. It was the only way to be able to share really quickly important information, particularly if it was around access to drug trials. You needed to get information really quickly out, unless you'd got someone who happened to be getting on a plane and was moving from one place to another, which was impossible. So I'm describing a world that no longer exists, although there are the odd fax machine. If you still go into hospitals, they have them there. But it was an ability to be able to send an image, a piece of paper, an update from one place to another. So that's how we communicated. And we were on the phone a lot, all the time. So there was always somebody that stepped. We had rotas for phones, so 24-hour rotas, and we'd take time to be on standby, etc., until we got radios, which helped us when we were working locally. So I'm talking about a technology that is just so from another place. I wouldn't even remember how to use it, although in fact you just shoved it in and it came out. It's rather like a scanner, it comes out the other end.
How do you see the internet within all this?
Wow, if we'd had that would have been amazing. So when we got to 99, 2000, it got easier because obviously we were then able to send files. I was no longer doing activism because I was working in an HIV organisation, and if I got arrested it would have made it very difficult for some of the people I was working with. But it didn't stop me sharing information and all that sort of thing. So when we actually got what was called the World Wide Web at that point, it was fantastic. So technology has enabled people to be fantastic activists, and I would hope that we pass on, we learn from others, but use different technological tools. So, we can influence now so very quickly, but at the time, we influenced by handing pieces of paper out, by talking to people, by being on the traditional media, so being on TV or getting radio interviews, etc. So there were several of us that got trained in doing media interviews and all that sort of stuff, because you kind of had to rock up and know what you were doing to get a message across really quickly.
And how do you see nowadays, first of all, lesbian representation, but also the AIDS crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And how is it represented now? Do you feel like it's accurately represented? And
Okay.
that's
Let
too
me
many
take
questions.
That's all right. Let me. I'll stay with AIDS, and then I'll end up with lesbians. So, AIDS. If we think about what we can see as drama is really powerful. Drama is a route for telling stories that have often remained invisible. But there's a BBC archive that's wonderful about three men. I think it's called Invisible Acts. I think it's certainly on BBC. It's about the acted real voices of gay men who were living with HIV, who faced significant amounts of discrimination, and were involved in AIDS activism. So there are all sorts of tools now to be able to use the history, if you're with me. In terms of portrayal, there aren't actually that many films, for instance, that cover AIDS. Everybody's heard of Philadelphia, but you can still watch it on Amazon and eventually get it on various other services. But I guess that's one side of a glamorous New York background. That's not the side that most people in Scotland, certainly not in Edinburgh, the people that I met, experienced. So I guess the history of those who are still living with HIV. I've got loads of friends who are still HIV positive, just about. The drugs just about kept them going, and they're still here, and they're able to live an accommodated life, and that's a good thing. Now, lesbians. The question was around visibility, wasn't it? Yeah.
Well, how do you feel as a lesbian now, as
right.
in comparison to then, and what does it mean to you?
So I guess I would say I feel less visible than I did, because I had a vibrant community that was ironically around two shared aims. We were anti-Section 28, and we were positively campaigning and working or aware of HIV. You could not be on a scene in Manchester or Birmingham or Bristol or certainly at that time when I visited Glasgow too, you could not ignore HIV. It was there, it was in front of you. So I guess there are more integrated spaces than there are now for me. I think we are both, there's more of us that are out, but we're less visible, ironically. People don't even, I've noticed within workplaces, many different workplaces, they still don't feel comfortable to describe who they are, who we are as lesbians. I certainly haven't been met with some colleagues with positivity. I'm fairly easy to get on with in work. So I guess I would say that I feel less visible now than I did. So I guess all of that stuff around kind of find your tribe, be with your people, who keeps you safe, that sort of stuff is incredibly important. And if we can be brave enough to tell stories whatever age we are, whoever we're telling it to, whether it's a next door neighbour, whether it's online, whether it's through Insta, then please do it. It's really, really powerful.
How did you look after yourself, and how was kind of your own struggles and stuff like that?
Sometimes I didn't look after myself. I am sure from anybody watching this who happens to be LGBTQI, we have all gone through an experience where self-care has been the last thing that we've done. We may not have dealt with our level of anxiety, we may have sat with stress, whatever we called it, we may have sat in a poor mental health state. So I certainly have hit many walls and crashed along the way, because you've got to keep your energy up. If you're trying to do something that actually is supporting other people, I have learned that the best thing that you can do is to support yourself first. I didn't know that in my 20s and my 30s, and I would urge all of us to just take a moment and take a breath and be kind to ourselves, because particularly if there's an injustice, or if you're trying to support someone who's going through a bad time for whatever reason, you've got to know where your boundaries stop and their boundaries start. So sometimes we can get carried away for all the right reasons. So thank you for the question, it's an important one.
Are there things you'd want your younger self to know that you know now?
Yeah, whatever you do, you have to keep doing it, because change comes slowly. Sometimes it's the snakes and ladders of change, that you go up a ladder but you then come down a snake, and that actually you can't take your rights and your civil liberties and who you are for granted. We are so lucky in many ways living in Scotland and the United Kingdom that we at least have some parts of the law in our favour. If there are so many countries where we are just not recognised, and talking about HIV, where the people die, they don't have access to treatment, they are still cast out, they are locked away. There are AIDS wards in places like Kenya and Nigeria where people are just simply not seen. They're not seen and they can't get out. So we have to keep telling the story, but we have to do so while still taking care of ourselves, in my view. So that's a really good question, and I'd urge us all to just have a wee think. What makes you feel good? Listen when you start to get really tired, and the voices of doubt and anxiety start to come, and you can't stop some of the thoughts. Just take a moment, reach out and talk to other people. It's important.
Kind of answers another question I've written down, but I was going to say, what do you want younger lesbians to know, and what do you want lesbians of the future, or queer people of any variant, but it's the same. It's what you want to tell yourself when you're younger, but also younger people now, I guess.
Have as much fun as you can. Reach out to those that care for you, around you, whether that's good friends, whether that's families. Keep telling your story. Listen really carefully to what other people are saying. We sometimes can get so lost in who we are, we're not hearing other people. So I guess I'd wish them to tell their story. I come apparently from at least a lesbian and a gay man in the family. I'm sure there were others before. So uncover your history. Look at where you're from. If you're rejected by those that supposedly are there to love you, there are other people that will love you along your pathway in life. So take the joy where you can, but not to the detriment of yourself. Don't harm yourself in the process. I think I've covered enough.
Okay,
I
think we've covered a lot. It's been amazing. Thank you. How do I stop this? Oh, okay. Cool.